I would like to move on now to the sophists' role in Greek society. This would be slide 5. And I would, on the issue of the sophists versus the philosophers, I encourage you to read the Rhetoric book, because he explains very clearly what the differences in their positions are in pages 32 and 33 of his book. The Greeks gradually developed a system of jurisprudence, or practice of the law, that became important in the regulation of Greek society. Vital to success in that venue, in arguing in the courts of the time, was the ability to speak persuasively. A great deal of there was therefore a great deal of demand for teachers and coaches in the art of rhetoric, and this led to a growth industry in teaching persuasive speaking. The sophists were very popular. I don't know if you're familiar with the Dale Carnegie courses, which enable people to win friends, influence people, and speak persuasively, or perhaps the Toastmasters, which does the same thing. But many of the traveling sophists, this was what they did, and they earned a great deal of money thereby and a good deal of leverage in society, because they offered Greek citizens education in the arts of verbal discourse, and their services were therefore very much in demand. Because litigants had to defend themselves before their peers in the courts, and so the common person had to learn good speaking skills in order to prosecute the cases that were brought. There were big differences then between the way law was practiced at that time and now, which I will discuss shortly. Okay, moving on to the next slide, which would be slide 6. Now, it is also true that Plato and Socrates were very distrustful of the sophists, because many of them accepted payment for their services. The sophists charged high fees, and because they taught skills for their clients' quick success in arguing legal cases. Because many of the sophists, too, were second-class citizens. They were foreigners as second-class citizens, and they traveled around, and people thought that they were pretty opportunistic and unreliable. They were also cultural relativists. That is to say, they believed that different cultures had different truths and that everything was relative, whereas the philosophers believed in particular truths and a particular kind of theology, one which you will find in Plato's Phaedrus, described quite at length. So the sophists were distrusted, and they were sort of at odds with the philosophers. I will talk more about that later in this presentation. I do want to step back for a minute, though, and mention that there are really 3 kinds of rhetoric. So we talk about rhetoric, and rhetoric means different things in different times and with different people. We're on slide 7 here. It's labeled Rhetoric 1, 2, and 3. And so since rhetoric takes up different definitions, I just wanted to clarify this. And so I call this Rhetoric 1 is viewed as a product in the form of a speech or a persuasive discourse. And that's what is being talked about when we're talking about the artifact that gets produced when one gives a speech. Rhetoric 2, however, is an ability. It meant, as we have said, the process of discovering in any case the available means of persuasion. So in that case, it's a skill or a potential or an ability. And Rhetoric 3 is an educational school subject, that is the study and practice of rhetoric. So these 3 definitions vary according to the context in which the term rhetoric is used, particularly in relation to Greek society. That's just sort of an aside to clarify what we're saying here. Moving on to slide 8, which has to do with formal education in ancient Athens. Here I again refer you to the Rhetoric book, page 33, where he describes how young boys were educated in Greek society. Another aside here, Greek society educated boys, didn't educate women. Marginalized groups in that society included slaves, foreigners, and women. Women were kept in the household, as we see in some cultures today. They were not out on the streets. They didn't circulate that much in society. They were pretty much cloistered And so it was then to which the society turned for the regulation of the polis and for the prosecution of the law and for other major issues. So boys began by studying grammar in the schools, young boys. That was the first subject that they studied. And at the age of 12 or 13, they moved on to the study of rhetoric. The aim in their education was to assist them in acquiring verbal sophistication and the ability to compose speeches. Normally, they would go to a school where they would see speeches being produced, and they would try to emulate the best possible speeches. So when they got to that age of 12 or 13, they were more or less working at the level of composing speeches. So first they learned grammar, and then they moved up to that. So it was very important at that time to acquire as much sophistication if you were a person who was going to be a citizen of Athens, and the ability to provide very good speeches that were well planned and well executed. Moving on to slide 9, I want to return to my discussion of the sophists and the philosophers on the status of rhetoric. This is a very important slide here. It compares the sophist position on a set of issues with the philosopher's position. The philosophers included Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and certain other prominent scholars in society. So that were the philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The sophists included Isocrates, Gorgias, and other individuals in society. So there were two groups, and they had very opposing positions. Let me explain what those positions are. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the sophists. Many of the sophists were multi-talented. That is, they were accomplished in many disciplines, philosophy, math, and physics. For them, rhetoric was an intellectual method, a way of generating knowledge. Plato's criticism of the sophists, that they were not interested in truth, but only in succeeding, gave the sophists a bad reputation. We do not read the Gorgias in this class, but if you ever read it, you will find that that was a very powerful production that Plato wrote, which has sort of given rhetoric a bad name ever since, because he has nothing good to say about the sophists. The sophists were competitors then to Plato and Aristotle. They had enterprises that were competing with the philosophers for the interest of the young men of Athens. And so there was a lot of competition between the two groups. The sophists believed that only provisional or probable knowledge was available to humans. They believed that each person is placed in time and history, and there is no guarantee of an ahistorical, transcendental truth. Basically, they believe that morality is contingent upon existing circumstances. What is considered right at one time may be wrong at another. If we were in class, we might discuss this. Do the standards of morality change over time? I think that the sophists were not too far off the mark there. Let's look back at the slide now that compares the two positions. The sophist position on truth, then, is that truth is not absolutely knowable, but is relative to social context, whereas the philosophers believe there is one truth, an ideal for which we should strive, and we see that in Plato's Phaedrus very clearly. The sophists believe that the aim of rhetoric is to succeed, to achieve one's ends. The philosophers believe that the best form of discourse is inquiry, not persuasion. Inquiry through dialectic, a question and answer method of finding the pure truth, through questioning one another and thinking further about the issue or the matter at stake. The sophists believe that training can make a good speaker out of a poor one. Just training, not education. And the philosophers, on the other hand, believe that a sound knowledge of philosophy and dialectic and good education makes for pure persuasion. So they had very different philosophies, if you will, about how to acquire rhetorical skill. The philosophers also believe that knowing how to communicate is all that is necessary. In other words, you don't need to be an expert in anything. You don't need to be well-informed. You just need to be an effective speaker, and you will succeed. The philosophers, on the other hand, believe that speaking can never be of high quality unless one speaks the truth for the welfare of the audience. Another thing I want to point out about this slide is that these are